Hi, I'm Hannah Smith, and today I will be talking about the unsung hero of the LGBT movement, Sylvia Rivera. So, a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today. So, my main objectives are going over important definitions. I'll be going over historical context, a brief background information, Stonewall Riots, major contributions and legacy of Sylvia, and then finally why we should study Sylvia. I also wanted to have a brief disclaimer. This is a very sensitive and uncomfortable topic to some, and while I'm not a part of the LGBTQ plus community, I hope I can provide some more insight about it today and alleviate some of that discomfort around the topic. Before we start, here are some quick definitions that I will be using throughout the presentation. So first is LGBT. This is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. Next is transgender, and this is identifying with a different gender than you are born with, used commonly in the 70s. Next is drag queen, and this is typically a gay man who dresses up as a woman for entertainment, and this was initially a slang word in the 19th century. Next is a cross-dresser. This is typically a man who wears traditionally women's clothing or accessories. Next, gay and lesbian. This is the sexual orientation of those who prefer the same sex. And lastly, closeted. This is those who have not opened up yet about their sexual orientation, and this was widely used in the 60s. Next, I will be talking about 50s and 60s historical context. In the 1950s, World War II broke out, in which started the challenging of gender roles and nuclear families. Women entered the workplace. However, after the war, society prevented women from working. Laws established moral codes such as public drunkenness and cross-dressing. At the end of World War II, there was a breakout called the Red Scare, which was the fear of communism in the United States. Anyone in society who seemed remotely different or unusual or didn't follow the rules could be labeled as a communist, and this specifically included the gay community. Lastly was the rise of countercultural movements such as Black Power, women's rights, free speech movement. So what was it like being gay or trans in the 50s and 60s? In the 50s and 60s, gayness was seen as a mental illness. This would be diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and many gay people went to psychiatric hospitals and went through conversion therapy that included shock therapy. At this time, sodomy was against the law, along with cross-dressing, and there was laws put in place that allowed bartenders to refuse service to get a gay person or anyone who was suspected of being gay. In light of this, many underground or speakeasy type gay bars started opening in order to have a safer environment to socialize amongst the gay community. However, police raids of these bars were common and usually turned violent. The media and newspapers would put names and addresses of those arrested at the bar as a form of humiliation and to keep people closeted. A brief history of background with Sylvia. So who was Sylvia Rivera? She was born in 1951 in the Bronx. Her mother was an immigrant from Venezuela and her father was an immigrant from Puerto Rico. Her father, when she was young, threatened to kill her mother and herself and eventually abandoned them. And that same year, Sylvia's mother killed herself. And so at the age of 3, she started living with her grandmother until 10 years old. And she attended a strict Catholic boarding school. And during this time at a young age, she started experimenting with makeup and cross-dressing, and this got her bullied in school and even suspended. At the age of 10, she left home and became a streetwalker, also known as a sex worker on the 42nd Street, and there was a large community of young trans people living on the streets, and this is where she met her friend Marsha P. Johnson, and Sylvia was also involved in the famous Stonewall Riots. So what were the Stonewall Riots? The Stonewall Riots were between June 28th and July 3rd, 1969. And the Stonewall Inn Bar was located in Greenwich Village, which was the largest gay neighborhood at the time. And this occurred at the same day as Judy Garland's funeral. And Judy Garland was a very influential icon to the gay community and even inspired the gay rainbow flag. At the time, the mafia owned all the gay bars in New York, and they used the bars as fronts for other illegal activities such as gambling and drug dealing, and they paid off the police to not raid the bars. That night, 2 police officers raided the bar, and the patrons of the bar resisted arrest, and they started throwing bottles and cocktails. Sylvia was there that night, and through the second cocktail, she was 17 at the time, and she explained in an interview that everyone was fed up with the mistreatment they received from the police. The TPF, or the Tactical Patrol Force, got involved, and the riot escalated. Thousands of people showed up over the next few days to show their support, and this was a pivotal turning point for gay rights movement. So the aftermath of Stonewall, the gay rights movement started to mobilize, and there were many public protests and demonstrations. There began the creation of many gay activist groups, and the movement started getting more recognition in the media, which it did not receive before. So these are Sylvia's major contributions to LGBTQ+ community. So her first major contribution was the Star House. Sylvia and Marsha P. Johnson created the Star House in 1970. STAR stands for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. This shelter provided protection and a place for queer homeless youth to stay. It provided legal and emotional support along with housing and food. Sylvia and Marsha were homeless for most of their lives, and they wanted to make a further difference in the community. They were the first trans women of color to start an organization, and this was also the first ever all-inclusive LGBTQ+ shelter. Sylvia was also a member of the GLA and GAA, which stands for Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance. Because of her unique gender identity and race and ethnicity, she pushed for intersectionality and voiced for the marginalized within the movement. In 1973, on Christopher Street Day, she delivered her famous speech named "Y'all Better Quiet Down." In the speech, she explains her mistreatment from the police and her life experiences, and explains how her, along with other lesbians and drag queens, have been left out of the gay movement, and that there needs to be change and rights for all, not just for some. And these are images from these different contributions, the Star House, the GLF and GAA, along with her famous speech. So Sylvia Rivera's legacy. So her legacy was she set the foundation for trans organizations. After her death, there were multiple organizations that started popping up, including the Transgender Law Center, the Sylvia Law Project, the National Center for Transgender Equality, and the Trans Justice Funding Project. She attributed to making the T a part of the now updated LGBTQ+ acronym. She's a major icon for trans and gay community. She's known for being undeniably herself and not changing herself for anyone throughout this entire movement. She's also coined with the term the Rosa Parks of the trans movement. So why exactly should we study about Sylvia? My first point is that current history courses in public education lack mention of the gay rights and trans rights movements. While they may talk about Black lives or the women's suffrage movements, there is no mention of these movements. And I think that is a problem as there is more growing community amongst the LGBTQ+. My second point is that transphobia and homophobia are still alive in our country, and talking about icons such as Sylvia will help normalize a gay and trans culture. And just recently, within this past year, there's been an increase of Black trans people being killed. And again, talking about Sylvia, talking about a member of the society who's made such a big impact, I think would be very beneficial to people. And lastly, Sylvia is an example of how being different in this country is not seen as an advantage. And our country, we think that everyone is equal, but in reality, that's not true. Within our laws, within how we treat each other, that is not true. And learning more about Sylvia and what she's gone through will help explain why there needs to be more equality in the United States. And this might work exciting. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation.